Out here in the Wild West, a man's past rides with him.
She tried to rob his wagon, the cowboy. Said, "You forgot my last name out there on the dusty trail." She tried to rob him, hands shaking, heart breaking, but he didn't reach for his gun, just smiled and said, "You forgot my last name." The road was long, and silence spoke louder than any words. He shared his bread. She shared her story, two souls too tired to run. When the bandits came, she stood her ground, and he saw the woman she used to be. That night, by the fire, he whispered, "People deserve one more chance, same as me." By sunrise, forgiveness rode beside them, and as the sky burned gold, the lonely cowboy found what he'd lost, not money, not pride, but a home in her eyes. The desert wind swept across the Arizona plains in 1879, carrying red dust that blurred the horizon. The dirt road stretched endlessly, filled only with the sound of wagon wheels grinding on dry gravel and the soft breath of a tired horse under the afternoon sun. Across the burning sky, the sunset glowed crimson, the last flame flickering over a dying land. A lone wagon rolled slowly through that emptiness. The man driving it was Elias Thorne, a middle-aged cowboy who had traveled nearly every road in the West. His leather coat was sun-worn, his gloves old and frayed, his eyes deep and still like a lake that had long forgotten its own reflection. He had no home, no one waiting, only the wagon, the horse, and the broken fragments of a life left behind. Far ahead, the wind rose again. A shadow appeared in the dust. Elias squinted, hand tightening on the reins. When the wagon reached the narrow pass, a frail woman stepped out. Her dress was torn, hair tangled with sand, hands trembling as she aimed a silver revolver straight at him. Her voice was hoarse. "Don't move. I just need the money." The gun shook, but her eyes held more fear than hatred. Elias didn't draw his weapon. He simply looked at her long and quiet before a faint, weary smile crossed his face. "If you're gonna rob me," he said calmly, "at least look me in the eye." She froze. Even the wind seemed to stop. For a heartbeat. The sunset wrapped them both in its dying glow, a worn-out traveler and a lost soul. Elias looked into her eyes and spoke again, softly. "You forgot my last name." The air broke, sharp as a snapped guitar string. The woman stood still, lips trembling. She didn't understand how this man knew her. Elias stepped down from the wagon, walking toward her, no threat, no anger. His gaze softened, carrying a sadness heavy enough to silence the world. "You're Julieta, aren't you?" Her name drifted into the wind, small but powerful enough to stir the dust of memory. Julieta blinked, and suddenly she was pulled back to a long-ago summer. The drought had scorched her town, leaving nothing but death and thirst. When everyone else had left, one man stayed behind, hauling water from town to town, saving her and her children from dying of thirst. That man was him. Her hands began to shake. The revolver slipped from her grasp, hitting the ground with a dry thud. Tears blurred her vision, and she didn't know why. Elias stood before her, still calm, still kind. "The world's cruel enough," he said softly. "Don't make yourself colder." The words struck deep sharp, but gentle. Julieta fell to her knees, shoulders trembling, eyes filled with the man she had forgotten. Elias bent down, picked up the gun, and set it back on the wagon. No accusation, no judgment, only the wind, carrying the scent of scorched grass and silence. Elias opened his satchel and took out a half-full bottle of water. "Drink," he said, "then get on the wagon. I don't have much, but there's room for someone who's lost." Julieta looked up, disbelief and shame mixing in her gaze. But he had already turned away, tightening the reins and climbing back onto the driver's seat, as if nothing had happened. Above them, the sun was sinking behind the mountains. The red light faded into purple, brushing against Elias's coat and stretching his shadow long across the sand, a streak of smoke against the desert floor. Julieta hesitated, then stepped forward and climbed onto the wagon beside him. Neither spoke. There was only the rhythm of hooves, the sigh of wind, and the slow creak of wooden wheels, steady as breathing. After a long silence, she whispered, "Why weren't you afraid of me? I could have killed you." Elias's eyes stayed on the road ahead. "Because in your eyes, I didn't see hate, just hunger and pain." Julieta turned away, tears slipping down her cheeks. And in that last light of day, she realized the man she tried to rob was the only one left who would still reach out to save her. The desert wind rose again, carrying the scent of dry wood and the faint chime of a wind bell tied to the wagon. Julieta gripped the bottle, staring at the sky now painted in red and violet. Beneath them, the dusty road stretched on, leading somewhere unknown. But maybe somewhere faith could be reborn. Before we begin, take a moment to comment the name of your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Then the voice faded, leaving only the sound of hooves echoing into the wind, a woman who had lost everything, and a man who had forgotten why he lived. And across the wild, red land of the West, they met again, not to steal from each other, but to return the one thing the world had taken away: hope. Part 1. The Cowboy Without a Home. Dawn spread a pale gold across the Arizona plains. Light filtered through the dusty mist, glinting off the dew that clung to his horse's reins. Elias Thorne woke early, as he always did before the wind had finished whispering its last words from the night before. He lit a small fire, brewed coffee in a dented tin pot, and sat in silence, watching the flames dance. Each breath he exhaled turned to smoke, vanishing into the cold morning air. Before him stretched a land owned by no one, just grass, rocks, and roads where hoofprints vanished before they could be remembered. His home had no walls, only a faded canvas tent pitched wherever the sky allowed. He lived simply one saddle, one wooden chair, and a small photograph tucked inside an old chest. The photo was worn, the edges frayed, but the woman's smile was still clear. Sarah, his wife. She had been gone 6 years now, taken by fever in the dead of winter. Elias hadn't buried her in the town cemetery. He dug the grave himself on the edge of the prairie where the sunrise could touch her every morning. Since that day, he had never stayed in one place for long. He believed that as long as he kept moving, grief could never catch up. That morning, Elias loaded the last of his crates onto the wagon. He spoke softly, his voice rough, as if speaking to an old friend who had heard it all before. "Come on, Dusty. We're heading to Trinity Creek. Don't fuss, there's coffee." The horse snorted, pawed the ground, then started forward. Elias smiled faintly, his weathered hand running along the animal's neck. "Good boy." The wagon creaked to life. Wooden wheels rolled over gravel, blending with the hiss of wind through dry grass. No music. No voices. only the steady rhythm of his heart, slow and even, like a soldier's drum long after the war was lost. Every time he passed a small graveyard, Elias would bow his head, never stopping. Perhaps he feared that if he stood still too long, he'd lose the strength to move again. Along the road, he noticed new wagon tracks, a few crow feathers scattered on the dirt. The West looked the same as always, dry, lonely, beautiful in a way that only pain could make it. Out here, he murmured, a man doesn't survive by his gun. He survives by being quiet with his pain. By noon, he stopped beside a shallow creek. He unhitched Dusty, let him drink, and sat against the wagon wheel. From his coat pocket, he took out an old handkerchief, the edges worn thin, the faint scent of flowers nearly gone. He laid it across his knee, smoothing the fabric with calloused fingers, his gaze lost somewhere far beyond the horizon. "Sarah," he whispered, "you'd laugh at me, wouldn't you? Still haven't learned how to stop loving you?" The wind answered in perfect silence. Then footsteps. Elias looked up, narrowing his eyes toward the ridge. Dust was rising in the distance, small, but clear. A figure. Familiar, but impossible. Not Sarah. She was gone. Still, his heart quickened, pulled backward through the years. Julieta, the woman he'd met the evening before. She sat slumped in the back of the wagon, still asleep, clutching the water bottle he'd given her. In the pale morning light, her face looked fragile, lips cracked and dry. But when she stirred and her eyes flickered open, Elias froze. That look, soft, weary, but full of something he hadn't seen in years, was Sarah's look in her final days. When she smiled faintly and whispered, "Don't be alone too long. Eli, a man can't live on memories." He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. Yet a tremor ran through his chest. He turned, watching her quietly as she drifted between sleep and waking, tears still crusted on her lashes. Elias sighed. "No," he muttered under his breath. "It can't be." But in that fragile moment, something stirred inside him, something he thought had died with Sarah. Gentleness. Not her gentleness, but the kind born from faith, the kind he had buried alongside her. The sun climbed higher, flooding the wagon with light. Elias tightened the reins, eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew the road ahead would not be the same, because for the first time in 6 years, there was someone else in his eyes besides himself. In the wild lands, he thought, sometimes a single glance is enough to awaken an entire life long forgotten. And even a man who has lost everything can find a reason to keep going just by seeing hope reflected in a stranger's eyes. Part 2. The Woman Who Lost Everything. Julieta sat quietly on the crates in the back of the wagon, clutching the bottle of water Elias had given her. The desert wind cut across her face, dry and sharp, opening the cracks on her lips until they bled. Since her husband's death, she could no longer remember how many miles she had walked, only that with every step. A piece of herself had been carried away by the wind. She once had a small home on the outskirts of Prescott. Her husband, a kind blacksmith, used to promise, "No matter how poor we are, I'll build us a house with a window facing the meadow." But then came a brutal winter, and the sickness that followed took him within 3 days. No money, no land, no help. The debt collectors came and took the house, Julieta gathered her 2 children, Della, 7, and Drew, 5, and fled south, hoping to find work on a ranch. But that land belonged to men who lived by strength, not mercy. She left the children with a woman who claimed she could watch them for a few weeks, while Julieta earned enough to come back. When she returned, the house was empty. The woman had sold her children to pay gambling debts. Julieta screamed until her voice broke. She begged, threatened, fell to her knees but was driven away like a stray dog. After that, she wandered. She slept in abandoned stables, ate moldy bread, drank rainwater. 3 months passed, and hatred and despair fused into one, a dull knife that never stopped digging into her chest. She had sworn never to beg again. There was only one way left to steal. Yesterday morning, when she saw Elias's wagon in the distance, she hid behind a rock, gripping her late husband's old revolver. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from hunger. She hadn't eaten in days. Her vision swam. Her ears rang. When she aimed the gun, she wasn't thinking about sin, only about 2 hungry faces somewhere in the world, if they were even still alive. But then the man smiled. A calm, steady smile. Not afraid. Not mocking. And the words he spoke, "If you're going to rob me, at least look me in the eye," pierced through the hardened shell around her heart. When he added, "You forgot my last name," she thought he was mocking her. But in his eyes, there was no cruelty, only a strange kind of recognition, as if he'd found a soul he once knew. Now, as the wagon rolled across the barren plain, Julieta watched him from behind. His dark hair moved with the wind, his shoulders broad and steady like a wall of quiet strength standing firm against a storm. She felt something unfamiliar, a mix of gratitude and fear. She finally whispered, I wasn't trying to hurt you. I just need to live. I just want to live." Elias didn't turn around. His voice was low, but clear. "You're not a thief. You're just lost." The words hit her harder than any bullet. Lost. Yes, she was lost. Lost from herself, from the road home, from the faith she used to hold. She lowered her head, tears falling onto her dust-covered hands. Elias stopped the wagon, climbed down, and searched his bag. He pulled out a piece of bread and another bottle of water, offering them to her. "Eat." Julieta shook her head. "I can't. I just tried to rob you." He shrugged lightly. "Then take it as a gift. A debt repaid." She looked up, eyes blurred. "Debt." Elias studied her for a long moment before replying. Quietly, "You once thanked me. Remember 6 years ago at the old water station near Prescott?" The memory broke open. The heat of that long-ago summer came rushing back, she and her 2 children on the edge of death, parched and weak. A stranger had stopped his wagon, handed them water and bread. She never remembered his face, only the sadness in his eyes and the roughness of his hands. Now, those same eyes were looking at her again. Julieta burst into tears, not out of shame, but relief. She cried like a child who had finally found someone safe enough to cry to. Elias didn't comfort her. He didn't say it's all right or don't cry. He simply stood there and laid his hand gently on her shoulder, a touch light, but steady. Julieta looked up, and in the crimson light of the setting sun, she saw his gaze not pitying, but understanding. In a desert where everything was dry and empty, a hand on the shoulder could be worth more than any promise. And in that moment, Giulietta knew she had been forgiven, even before she could ask for it. Perhaps that was why, for the first time in years, she believed there might still be a road left to follow. Part 3. The Road of Silence. Evening began to fall. The sun slipped toward the horizon, leaving a trail of red light stretched across the endless wilderness. The wind carried dry sand and the faint scent of burning wood from somewhere far away. Elias's wagon kept rolling forward slow but steady down a road with no clear destination. Giulietta sat beside him, clutching the thick coat he had lent her that morning. She gazed ahead at the line where the sky touched the earth, where everything melted into one vast shade of amber and rust. No one spoke. There was only the rhythm of hooves, the grind of wooden wheels over gravel, the breathing of survivors. Elias glanced at her now and then, saying nothing. His face was calm, his eyes fixed on the road as if he were driving through the memories of his own life. He was used to silence. For 6 long years, silence had been his only companion. But today, that silence felt different. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't empty. It was warm, soft, like the breath of another soul quietly sharing the same space. Giulietta's rough hands rested on her knees. She trembled not from the chill, but from the confusion of sitting beside a man who neither asked, nor judged, nor demanded gratitude. He had simply offered her a seat, a piece of bread, a sip of water, and then went on in silence. And somehow, that silence brought her more peace than any words ever could. When the wind grew stronger, Elias pulled the leather coat over her shoulders. Giulietta startled but didn't refuse. She caught the faint scent of horsehide, smoke, and old coffee, the smell of the West itself, raw and honest. "After a while," she asked quietly, "Where are you going?" "Nowhere," Elias replied in his low voice. "Just moving, hauling freight, then moving again. You don't have a home." He smiled faintly, a tired, bittersweet smile. "Sure I do. Anywhere there's a sunset and a horse willing to listen." Giulietta studied him. In the glow of dusk, the lines on his face deepened the creases at his eyes, the sunburned skin on his cheeks, each mark telling a story of endurance. And yet, in his gaze, there was something rare, a fragile light, the kind that survives even after everything else has burned away. They fell into silence again. The road stretched endlessly, with nothing but wind and the horses breathing to fill the air. But this silence wasn't cold. It felt like the breath after pain, like a heartbeat rediscovering its rhythm after years of fear. When the sun finally disappeared, the world turned violet. Elias stopped the wagon near a rocky hill where low trees broke the wind. He climbed down, gathered dry branches, and built a fire. Flames flickered, snapping softly, casting amber light across their faces. Giulietta sat close, staring into the fire. After a long while, she murmured, "I don't know how to thank you." Elias answered simply, "You don't need to. Everyone gets lost sometimes. When you find the road again, just keep walking." She nodded. The wind eased. Beside the fire, Giulietta closed her eyes and began to sing a faint lullaby, broken and trembling, but full of soul. Her voice wavered, catching between sobs. A lullaby. Elias froze. The piece of wood in his hand burned down to an ember. He turned to her fragile voice, thin and unsteady, carried a beauty that cut straight through him. Each note pulled him back to a small wooden cabin years ago. where Sarah once sat by the window, singing softly after supper. That same gentle tone, honest and quiet, made him forget the wind, the world, everything. He swallowed hard, but his throat tightened instead. He turned away, staring toward the horizon where firelight blended into the dark. Julieta didn't know. She kept singing softer and softer until the lullaby faded into the crackle of the fire. Then she fell asleep, her head resting against the wagon wheel, hair falling loosely across her shoulder. Elias rose, took a blanket, and gently draped it over her. He looked down at her face, worn, fragile, yet strangely peaceful. For the first time in years, something stirred within him, something fragile, thawing like ice breaking on a spring river. He sat down again by the fire, eyes lost in the flames. The man who had buried his heart in silence now feared that very silence, because within it, he could still hear her lullaby and feel the ache of what he'd lost. That night, across the wild desert, there were only two souls, one who had lost everything, and one who no longer believed in anything, sharing the same quiet, as if silence was the only language left they both understood. Part 4. The Return of Danger. That afternoon, the sunset burned across the sky, spilling fire over the red dirt road. The ground glowed like an open wound, and dust rose in swirling waves beneath the horses' hooves. Elias and Julieta were on their way to the next small town he planned to rest a few days. She still had no idea where she would go after that. The air felt wrong. Too still. The horse suddenly jerked its head and sniffed the wind, letting out a nervous snort. Elias's instincts tightened. Years on the trail had taught him one truth when a horse senses fear. It's because someone's out there. He pulled the reins, scanning the horizon. The dry wind lashed his face, carrying the faint scent of gunpowder and the metallic rasp of steel against steel. From behind a ridge, 3 riders appeared, dust swirling around them, faces hidden behind scarves, eyes cold as iron. Julieta froze. They weren't ghosts of her imagination. These were real bandits. Elias's voice dropped low. "Get down. Hide behind that rock. Don't make a sound." But Julieta didn't move. Her hands clutched the edge of the seat. "What about you? I'm used to this," Elias said calmly, glancing at her. "Go." Still, she stayed. The riders closed in. One shouted, "Leave the wagon, cowboy. Don't make us shoot." Elias stepped down slowly, raising his hands. His voice was steady. "It's just dry goods and water. Take what you want. I won't fight." The leader sneered. "That's sweet. But I don't trust anyone." He cocked his gun. The click echoed through the open air. "Stop!" Julieta screamed. Without thinking, she leapt from the wagon, grabbed the old revolver lying near the wheel, and stood in front of Elias. The wind whipped her hair. Dust stung her face, but she didn't back down. Her hands shook violently, yet she held the trigger firm. "He has nothing you want," she shouted, her voice breaking but fierce. The outlaw raised an eyebrow, smirking. "Who's she?" "Cowboy. Your wife." Elias said nothing. He looked at Julieta, a mixture of fear and disbelief in his eyes. "Julieta," he said softly, "put the gun down. You don't have to do this." "No," she said through tears. "I've been running my whole life. Not today." The men laughed, a cruel, metallic sound. One raised his pistol to fire into the air. Elias lunged, pulling Giulietta aside just as the shot cracked through the desert. The smell of powder spread across the dry wind. In one swift motion, Elias drew his Colt. A second shot rang out, the bullet burying itself in the dirt, inches from the bandit's boot. "Drop your weapons," he barked, voice low but commanding. The men hesitated. Something in his stance, the calm, the certainty, told them this was no ordinary man. In the blood-red sunset, Elias stood unshaken, eyes sharp as a blade. Beside him, Giulietta trembled, her gun quivering in her grasp. "We don't lose to beggars," one bandit snarled. He raised his weapon. Elias didn't wait. A single shot split the air. The man fell, dust rising around his body like red smoke. The remaining two turned their horses and fled into the fading light. Silence returned heavy, alive, broken only by the horses' breathing and the pounding of two human hearts. Giulietta dropped the gun. Her knees buckled. Elias caught her before she fell. "Are you hurt?" "No," she whispered, tears streaking her dusty face. "Just scared." He smiled faintly, his voice soft but sure. "Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's standing your ground while you are." She looked up at him, confused, shaken, moved. Elias wiped the sweat from her forehead with his sleeve and said quietly, "You did something I never thought I needed someone to do. Thank you." Giulietta lowered her head, voice trembling. "I just didn't want you to die. Not because you saved me, but because I can't lose anyone else." Elias went still. In her eyes, he saw something he thought he'd lost long ago, the courage to care. He breathed deeply and looked toward the horizon. The sunset bled across the sky, fierce and tender, as if the world itself were gasping after the storm. Giulietta sat down, hands still trembling. Elias picked up her fallen gun, emptied the bullets, and placed it back in the wagon. "Next time," he said quietly, "use those hands to hold on to life, not to fire." She smiled through her tears. "And you," Elias looked toward the dying light. "Me, I'll use mine, to protect what's left." They sat together, watching the last traces of sun fade beyond the ridge. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder and dust, but inside both of them, something else had ignited a fragile warmth, the kind that heals wounds even as it burns. For the first time since they met, Elias saw strength where fear once lived in her eyes, and for the first time in her life, Giulietta no longer felt like the weak one. Part 5. The Promise by Firelight. Night fell faster than usual. The western sky turned ink black, leaving only a thin streak of fading light at the edge of the horizon. The desert wind carried the lingering smell of gunpowder, the memory of the fight that had nearly cost them both their lives. Elias set up camp by a rocky ridge, gathering dry branches for a small fire. The flames flickered, painting both their faces in shades of gold and amber, faces lined with exhaustion, but softened by silence. Giulietta sat against the wagon wheel, one hand pressed to her left shoulder. Blood had soaked through her sleeve, staining the fabric dark red. Elias noticed and frowned. He pulled a clean strip of cloth from his satchel and approached quietly. "Let me see." "It's nothing," she whispered. "Just a scratch." He crouched in front of her, calm but firm. "Out here, even a scratch can kill you if it festers." He gently rolled up her sleeve. Giulietta flinched, eyes wary, but didn't pull away. His fingers were rough and warm, the scent of leather and smoke clinging to them. He poured whiskey over the wound. She gasped, shoulders trembling. Elias held her arm steady. Hold still, just for a moment. When the bandage was tied, Elias sat beside her, staring into the fire. The wind whistled through the rocks, scattering sparks into the night before swallowing them again. Neither spoke. Only the sound of crackling wood and the quiet rhythm of the desert surrounded them. Julieta looked up. The firelight flickered in Elias's eyes deep and still, carrying a quiet sorrow that somehow made him seem unbreakable. "You've lost someone, haven't you?" she asked softly. He paused for a long time before answering, his voice low and distant. "My wife, Sarah. She died of fever one winter. I buried her on a hill up north where the sun rises every morning." Julieta lowered her head, gripping her sleeve. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "No need. She once told me, if you ever see someone thirsty, give them water for me." He looked at her. "That's what I did." Julieta's throat tightened. She turned away so he wouldn't see her tears. The wind bent the flames sideways. Their shadows stretched long over the sand. After a moment, Elias spoke again. Slowly, each word weighted with meaning. "You know, when you pointed that gun at me, I wasn't afraid. I just felt sorry." Julieta gave a faint, bitter laugh. "Sorry for the woman who tried to rob you." He smiled gently. "I saw the fear in your eyes. Not fear of me, fear of yourself." She fell silent. The firelight shimmered on her face, turning her tears into glass. Then Elias's voice dropped, soft and steady, the kind of voice that seems to come from the heart instead of the mouth. "You forgot my last name, but I never forgot yours." Julieta looked up. The words struck like lightning through the night between them, breaking whatever wall still stood. "You remembered me." Elias met her gaze. "I remembered the woman who smiled even when she was starving. The one who gave half her bread to her children before taking a bite. Not everyone keeps kindness when the world takes everything." Julieta's tears spilled over, landing on the back of his hand. "You shouldn't be kind to me. I don't deserve it." Elias shook his head slowly. "Kindness isn't about who deserves it. If we stop being kind, we forget who we are." Her sob turned into a quiet tremor. She reached out and took his hand. His was large, sunburned, scarred yet warm, solid, alive. The firelight reflected in their eyes his full of grief, hers full of fear, both trembling not from danger, but from the risk of believing again. To trust once more, after losing everything, was its own kind of terror. "Elias," she whispered, "I don't know if I should thank you or fear you." "Neither," he said softly. "Just don't run anymore." She nodded faintly, eyes closing. A tear slid down her cheek and hissed out as it touched the coals. Elias watched her for a long while. Then he pulled a blanket from the wagon and draped it over her shoulders. "Sleep. The road's long tomorrow." Julieta leaned gently against his shoulder, her fragile frame trembling. Elias stayed still, letting her warmth seep through his coat. Above them, a crescent moon hid behind drifting clouds. The fire burned lower, its light dim but steady enough to show two hands joined loosely together, the hand of a man who had lost his faith, and of a woman who had just found it again. That night, no promises were spoken. Yet one was born in the firelight, not made of words, but of the quiet touch between two souls learning how to trust again. Part 6. The Search for the Children. When the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, Elias gently woke Julieta. They packed their things, stamped out the fire, and set off again. The night had been cold, but the morning sun burned bright and clear, and under that light, everything felt sharper: the scars, the silence, and the fragile hope that refused to die. Their path led them toward Prescott, a dusty town nestled at the foot of a hill, once a gathering place for traders, blacksmiths, and drifters living off luck and grit. It was also the place where Julieta's 2 children had been sold like cheap property. The road into town was quiet. Low wooden houses lined the main street. Rusted iron signs hung crookedly, and the saloon lights were already glowing even before noon. The air smelled of dry grass, tobacco, and sweat. Voices shouted prices, horses neighed, and somewhere across the street, a banjo played out of tune the chaotic orchestra of a western town where everyone carried a story they didn't dare tell. Julieta said nothing, the entire ride. Her hand clutched the bandage on her shoulder, her gaze fixed on the ground, trembling from something deeper than fear. Elias didn't press her with questions. He simply offered her a canteen now and then. When they reached a weathered signpost outside town, she finally spoke, her voice hoarse. "They're here. The woman who sold them. She mentioned a ranch owner north of town. That's all I know." Elias nodded. "Then that's where we start." They walked through the market together. The townsfolk turned to stare a rugged cowboy with a stranger woman, thin and pale, her shoulder still wrapped in fresh bandages. Julieta lowered her head under their curious eyes. They stopped at a general store, a coffee shack, and a stagecoach station. No one knew anything, or perhaps no one wanted to say. By late afternoon, Elias stopped outside an old saloon called Silver Spur. He said quietly, "Places like this gossip costs less than whiskey." Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the coarse laughter of drunk men. Glasses clinked. Elias pulled up a chair and dropped a few coins on the table. The bartender, a gray-haired man with sharp eyes, leaned closer. "What are you looking for, stranger?" Elias replied calmly. "A man named Morgan. Owns a ranch up north. He hires kids to work for him, doesn't he?" The bartender smirked. "Everyone in Prescott hires kids. Question is, what's it to you?" Elias slid over more coins. "I'm looking for 2, a boy and a girl. Sold about 6 months ago." The room quieted slightly. A few patrons glanced their way. The bartender lowered his voice. "Heard something. Morgan bought 2 from a woman who came through. The boy works the stables. The girl washes dishes. Place is half a day's ride north. But Morgan's not the kind to chat." Elias nodded, pushing the coins toward him. "Thank you. The drink's yours." When they stepped back into the street, Julieta's voice trembled. "Do you think it's them?" Elias looked at her, steady and sure. "You'll bring them back. I'll help you." Her breath caught. Why are you helping me? I'm nothing to you." Elias smiled faintly. "Because I believe in second chances." The words struck her harder than she expected. For years, no one had believed in her, not even herself. They continued north. By sunset, they stopped beneath a tree along the dusty road. The wind was turning cold from the mountains. Elias built a small fire and broke a piece of bread in half, handing her one. "Have you ever lost faith in people?" she asked. He looked into the fire. "I did. But then I realized when you stop believing, you stop living. That night, Julieta didn't sleep. She watched the fire die down and listened to the wind moving through the dry branches. Somewhere deep inside, a flicker of hope reignited, fragile, but real. By morning, they set off early. The path to Morgan's ranch wound through narrow passes lined with black rock. When they arrived, the sun was already high. The ranch stretched wide, fenced with timber, filled with the sounds of horses and shouting. A heavy-set man with a beard, Morgan was barking orders at a group of children working in the dust. Julieta froze. Among them, she saw a thin boy with dark hair carrying a water bucket and a small girl sweeping the porch. Her heart stopped. Drew and Della, her knees went weak. She wanted to run, to scream their names, but Elias grabbed her wrist gently. "Wait," he murmured. "Not yet. If you rush in, he won't let them go." Tears welled in her eyes. "Then what do we do? Let me talk." Elias walked toward the rancher, calm and steady. Morgan turned, frowning. "What do you want? I'm here on business," Elias said. "Got something private to discuss." They stepped aside, voices low. Julieta couldn't hear, only saw Elias place a leather pouch heavy with coins on the wooden rail. Morgan sneered, shook his head. Elias said something then, and his eyes turned cold, the kind of look that didn't need a gun to make a man listen. After a long moment, Morgan shrugged, pocketed the money, and grunted. "The kids don't owe me nothing anymore. Take 'em." Julieta couldn't breathe. Elias turned to her and nodded softly. "Go. They're waiting." She ran faster than she had in years. Drew, Della. The children stopped, eyes wide, frozen. Then the little girl whispered, her voice trembling. Mama Julieta dropped to her knees. Arms open. The three of them collided in an embrace that shook with sobs and dust and sunlight. Elias stood a few steps back, jaw tight, eyes low. The scene tore something open in him, but not in pain. In peace. He thought of Sarah, and how he'd once longed for one more moment like this. Now, watching Julieta and her children, he felt as though part of his own lost past had finally been redeemed. Julieta looked up, tears shining. "You did what I didn't even dare dream of." "Why? Why did you help me?" Elias's voice softened. "Because once, someone saved me. And I knew if I didn't help you, I wouldn't deserve the woman I loved." Julieta's tears fell freely now. She reached for his hand, trembling, but strong. "Thank you, Elias. I owe you my life." He shook his head gently. "No, Julieta. You owe it to them and to yourself." The late sun bathed them all in golden light. The wind brushed through the dry grass, soft and forgiving, and in that quiet, Julieta understood the children she had found again were not just her own. They were the pieces of Elias's heart, the lost parts of himself that had finally come home too. Part 7. The Valley of Redemption. The road to Morgan's ranch cut through a barren valley, flanked by old cacti and a few blackened eucalyptus trees scarred by lightning. The sky hung heavy and gray, thick with the scent of rust and dry hay, the promise of a coming storm. Elias stopped the wagon about 100 yards from the wooden gate. A thin plume of smoke rose from a chimney in the distance. Beside him, Julieta's hands were clenched white. Since learning her children were truly here, she hadn't said a single word, her silence filled with a fear that words could not hold. "You don't have to go in," Elias said softly. "Let me talk first." "No," Julieta whispered, voice trembling. I need to see them, even if it's just once. Elias nodded. He understood some wounds only begin to heal when you face them. As they neared the ranch, the crack of a whip and the harsh coughs of children echoed from the stables. A large man with a thick beard stood shouting orders. Morgan, the notorious ranch owner who used children as cheap labor. Elias stepped down and tapped the fence. I'm not here for trouble, he said calmly. Just to talk. Morgan turned, eyes narrowing. What do you want? I heard you've got 2 children working here. Elias replied. I came to buy their freedom. Morgan barked a laugh. Buy them, this ain't no jailhouse. Cowboy. I paid good money. If you want them, it'll cost double. Elias's voice stayed even, but his gaze hardened. I can pay. But do you know their mother is here watching? Morgan glanced past him. Julieta stood by the fence, wind whipping her tangled hair, her eyes fixed on the small figures behind the corral, a girl and a boy, dirty and thin, hauling buckets of water, her breath caught. Della. Drew, she whispered, as if afraid sound itself would break the moment. The children froze. Della turned, her dark eyes blinking rapidly. Drew hesitated, studying the woman who looked both familiar and distant. 6 months was long enough for memory to fade, but not to disappear. He frowned, confused, then lowered his gaze back to his work. Julieta felt her heart tear open. Her hand pressed to her chest to hold it together. Elias stepped forward, his tone cold and steady. You can't keep them. I'll pay you double. Let them go. And if I say no? Morgan sneered. Elias didn't move. He pulled a leather pouch from his coat and dropped it onto the table beside Morgan. The clink of coins rang sharp in the still air. Because they're not property, Elias said, slow and firm. They're people. Something in his voice made the rancher hesitate. Morgan looked at the pouch, then into Elias's eyes, calm, unwavering, with a strength that didn't need a gun. After a tense silence, he grunted and waved his hand. Take 'em, if she's really their mother. I don't need the trouble. Julieta could barely breathe. She stepped forward, her legs trembling, dust crunching beneath her boots. The children turned, startled. Della, she said softly, her voice cracking. It's Mama. The little girl backed away, eyes wide. Drew stepped in front of her, his voice rough but protective. We don't know you. The words struck like a blade. Julieta tried to smile, but her lips quivered. Don't you remember? You had a wooden doll. I carved it from an old branch. You called her Star. Della's eyes flickered a spark of memory lighting in the dark. Star, she whispered. Julieta nodded, tears streaming down her face. That's right. Sweetheart, Mama's here. I came back for you. Drew looked at his sister, then at the woman before him. Memories flooded in her voice, singing him to sleep. The smell of bread burning in their small oven. The warmth of her hands. His throat tightened. Mama, he said at last. His voice barely a breath. Julieta fell to her knees. The sound that came from her chest was half sob, half prayer. She pulled them both into her arms, crying into their hair, dust and tears mixing on her face. Della clung to her from behind, shaking with sobs. Elias stood a few yards away. He turned his face to the darkening sky as the first gust of storm wind tore through the valley. He didn't want them to see his eyes glisten. "I'm sorry." Julieta wept, clutching her children. "I'm so sorry for all the pain." "It's okay." "Mama," Drew said between tears, "we knew you'd come." Elias slowly stepped back, giving them space. He walked to the wagon and leaned against the wheel, staring out toward the plains where thunderclouds gathered. His heart pounded not from fear, but from something far softer. He had just witnessed redemption itself. A mother once broken by the world had just been called back to life by a single word, "Mama." Julieta held her children close, then looked toward Elias. Her lips trembled, but she couldn't speak. He gave a small nod, eyes gentle as sunset. Then the rain came heavy, relentless. It washed the blood from Julieta's shoulder, the dust from her face, and maybe, just maybe, the past from all their souls. Across the fence, Elias lifted his hat and called out over the storm, "Let's go home." "Julieta, the road's long, but you're not walking it alone anymore." Julieta hugged her children tighter and nodded. Under the western rain, the three of them stepped out of the valley of redemption, where the past was cleansed and the lost found their way home. And Elias, standing in the downpour, felt warmth rise in his chest, because he knew if there was any place where a lonely man could find meaning again, it was here, in this valley where forgiveness bloomed from pain. Part 8. The house that breathed again. After the rain that swept through the valley, the world felt cleansed. The scent of wet grass filled the air, and the wind carried the gentle breath of life across the plain. Elias guided the wagon along the long road between fields. The earth still marked by the tracks they had left days ago, but now, that same road seemed to lead toward another life. Julieta sat in the back, arms wrapped around Della and Drew. None of them spoke. Words were too small for what filled their hearts. Della rested her head on her mother's shoulder, while Drew toyed with the reins, occasionally glancing back at Elias. The boy had never met a man like him, quiet, but whose every gesture carried the weight of simple goodness. When the sun reached its height, Elias pulled the reins and stopped at the foot of a small hill. At its crest stood an old wooden house. Part of the roof had caved in. The walls were streaked with age, and the door creaked in the wind. It looked battered, yet still standing stubborn, like the man who once called it home. "This used to be my house," Elias said. "No one's lived here for years. If you'd like, we can fix it." Julieta stepped down from the wagon, gazing at the ruin, the moss-covered roof, the shattered windows, and yet, to her, it wasn't a ruin at all. It was a chance. Elias pulled out a hammer, some nails, and a few old planks. Without another word, he began to work. Drew fetched wood and nails. Della gathered small stones around the porch, and Julieta stitched a torn curtain by hand. The sun burned high, sweat dripped down their faces, but no one complained. Julieta stood on the steps, sewing slowly. Every trembling stitch a thread of memory, every knot a fragment of faith tied back together. From the roof, Elias looked down and saw her smile, faint, but real. She was no longer the terrified woman he'd met on that dusty road. There was light in her eyes now, the light of someone who had begun to live, not merely survive. By dusk, they stopped to rest. Elias built a fire by the porch, roasting dry fish and corn cakes. The children's laughter echoed the first laughter in months. Giulietta watched them, her heart softening with warmth she thought she'd never feel again. Every so often she looked toward Elias, but he kept his eyes on the fire, pretending not to notice. When night came, Giulietta stepped behind the house. The old wall still stood, scarred but strong. She took a small knife and carved into the wood carefully. Slowly, Giulietta Thorne. Her hand trembled not from fear, but from a strange new feeling belonging. Thorne, his last name. She hadn't asked permission. She didn't even dare think what it meant. But the name felt like an anchor, something steady in a world that had only ever shifted beneath her feet. Elias appeared at the doorway. He stood still, watching. Moonlight fell across her shoulders, glinting off the fresh carving and the healed scar on her arm. Giulietta turned, startled. I just wanted to carve it there, she stammered softly, to remember that I once had a place to return to. Elias said nothing. He stepped closer, then stopped close enough to feel her warmth, far enough not to break it. The wind brushed through her hair, silvering it under the moonlight. He looked at her for a long time, his eyes deep, clear, and quietly full spoke the thousand things he couldn't say, aloud admiration, gratitude, and something fragile and growing that frightened him more than any gun ever could. Giulietta understood. She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. Thank you, Elias, for this house, for everything. It's not mine, he said quietly. It's ours if you want it to be. She didn't answer. Instead, she placed her hand gently over the name she had carved, as if soothing an old wound. Elias watched her for a moment, then turned away, afraid that if he stepped closer, the fragile piece would shatter. A breeze swept through, carrying the scent of new grass and the warmth of a house coming back to life. The firelight from inside flickered, casting a soft glow on the two figures, as if the night itself paused to watch. Della ran out, laughing. Mama, Mr. Elias. The house looks beautiful. Giulietta turned, smiling. Elias bent down, ruffling the girl's hair. Because someone finally taught it how to breathe again. That night, for the first time in years, 4 people sat together beneath one roof with fire, laughter, and faith. The house that had once died now lived again, and so did their hearts. Later, as Giulietta set the table, she glanced out at the porch. Elias sat there quietly, a tin cup of coffee in his hands, moonlight painting his shoulders silver. She walked out and sat beside him. They said nothing, only looked at the home before them, where patched windows glowed with warmth and the children slept soundly inside. Elias spoke softly, his voice deep and steady. This house was silent for 6 years, but now it breathes again. Maybe I do too. Giulietta turned toward him, eyes tender. You're not alone anymore, Elias. He met her gaze, a calm smile in his eyes, gentle as the wind over the prairie. He didn't answer, only nodded once. And under that vast western sky, the old wooden house began to breathe again, not through fire or timber, but through the rhythm of hearts that had finally found their way home. Part 9. The first rain. Clouds rolled in from the west, slow, heavy, like a long-lost traveler returning home. Across the endless prairie, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and the green breath of newly sprouted grass. The first rain of the season was coming, the kind that Westerners waited months for, through heat, dust, and silence. Elias sat on the porch steps, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, listening to the distant growl of thunder. Inside, Julieta folded blankets while Della and Drew chased each other around the room, their laughter light and bright, the kind that made the walls seem alive again. The first drops began to fall lop, 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 tapping softly against the new tin roof, echoing through the wide valley like the beginning of a gentle song. Drew shouted, "Mama, it's raining. It's really raining." Della stretched her small hands toward the window, catching a few stray drops and giggling. Julieta hurried out to the porch. She tilted her face to the sky and breathed deeply. The scent of rain, the one she hadn't dared to dream of for years, because rain had always meant loss and fear, now smelled sweet, almost like forgiveness. Elias stepped out behind her. From where he stood, framed in the doorway, he saw a scene that stole his breath, 3 figures laughing in the light of a storm. The house around them alive in ways he'd thought impossible. He had once told himself he'd help them and move on. But now, he no longer wanted to leave. A flash of lightning lit the roof, and Elias glanced up, not a single leak. He smiled quietly. A man who just won a quiet war. "This roof's holding stronger than my heart," he said, half joking. Julieta laughed, rain dripping down her hair. "Don't say that. I haven't tested your heart yet." Their laughter blended with the rain, soft, warm, human. Later, the family gathered around the old wooden table. Drew added wood to the fire. Della poured hot water into tin cups, and steam rose like a ghost of peace. Julieta placed a bowl of soup in the center, the aroma of dried beef and onions filling the room. She looked up at the ceiling-patched boards, pale and new against the old wood. Every piece had a story, every nail a trace of effort and faith. No leaks, no drafts, no fear. The house stood whole again, as if it had found its soul. Julieta whispered, barely louder than the rain outside. "It's the first roof that didn't leak, and the first heart that didn't leave." Elias froze, then slowly set his spoon down. In Julieta's eyes, he saw no fear, only peace, a peace he thought he'd never know again. He smiled faintly. Then maybe it's home. The moment lingered, still and golden. Outside, rain fell in steady rhythm, the rhythm of a heartbeat. Inside, the fire crackled, its glow softening the faces of 4 souls once broken, now whole beneath a roof built not just with wood, but with trust and tenderness. Dela tilted her head, asking innocently, "Mr. Elias, what is a home?" Elias smiled at her. "It's where you're no longer afraid of the wind. It's where someone stays, no matter where you go." Julieta's lips trembled. Tears slipped quietly down her cheeks, not tears of pain, but the kind that fall when a heart finally believes it's safe again. The rain kept on through the night. Each drop against the roof whispered the same promise. Everything will be all right. When the children were asleep, Julieta stepped out onto the porch. Rain shimmered under the faint moonlight, pooling in small mirrors across the yard. Elias joined her silently, draping his coat over her shoulders. They stood side by side, saying nothing, listening to the rain's steady rhythm, soft as a lullaby. Julieta leaned her head gently against his shoulder. Elias didn't move, just exhaled slowly, a breath that mingled with the cool, rain-scented air, carrying the quietest smile he'd worn since the day Sarah died. Outside, the rain kept falling, Inside, the house stood strong, and within them both, something else held firm, something Elias finally recognized by its simplest, truest name, hope. Part 10. The Sunset of Second Chances. Spring returned, soft and quiet like the first breath of morning. The hills around the house were wrapped in a tender green, and the dry creek beside the slope now whispered again with running water. The air carried the scent of new earth, wildflowers, and the hum of insects, the song of life returning. Elias and Julieta rose early. Drew tended the fire inside while Della sat on the porch, humming the lullaby her mother had taught her. The house felt warm not just from the fire, but from something deeper. It felt like family. Outside, Elias laid out several burlap sacks of seeds beans, corn, and barley. His rough hands trembled slightly, not from fatigue, but from an emotion he had long buried hope. Julieta stepped out, hair tied neatly, her skirt brushed with dust, a faint smile lighting her face. "You're planting all of that?" "Yes." Elias said with a nod, "If we don't start now, there'll be nothing to harvest next season." "Then let me help," she said. Under the morning sun, they worked side by side, Elias digging neat furrows, Julieta scattering seeds and covering them with dry soil. Sweat beaded on their foreheads, but neither complained. Above them, a flock of birds wheeled across the sky, their cries carrying like blessings. From time to time, they paused and exchanged glances, the quiet kind shared between people who had once lost everything, yet dared to build again. Then Elias stopped, leaning on his shovel. He looked at her for a long moment. The sunlight reflected off the fresh soil, warming her face, and her eyes seemed brighter than the spring sky. His voice came low, rough, but steady. "I want to build something that lasts, if you'll let me." Julieta froze. She didn't need to ask what something meant. It wasn't just the house or the field, it was a life, a shared one. Her hands tightened around a clump of earth. Tears welled up not from sorrow, but from the aching disbelief that her heart was still capable of hearing such words. She lifted her gaze, her voice trembling, yet her smile small and sure. "I'm staying." The world stilled. The wind swept gently through the grass, rippling like a green sea. In the distance, Della and Drew chased each other, laughter echoing over the plain, mingling with the scent of turned soil and sunlight. Elias stepped closer, his boots pressing into the soft earth. He reached out his hand slow, careful, reverent. Julieta placed hers into his. Their fingers intertwined firm, warm, unshakable. Around them stretched the vast prairie, bathed in the amber light of a dying sun. The sky deepened to gold, then crimson. Their shadows stretched across the newly planted field, two souls once broken, now rooted in the same ground. Elias looked at the sunset, his voice barely more than breath. "We don't get to choose who we meet, Julieta, but we can choose who we stay with." She turned to him, eyes glistening. "Then I'll stay with the man who never gave up." He smiled the quiet, unguarded kind. From behind them, Della's voice rang out, "Mama Elias." "Look." They turned. The western sky was on fire with light, the whole prairie drenched in gold. The house, the hills, even the tiny bean seeds shimmered in the glow. From inside came the gentle strum of a guitar Drew, playing the old instrument Elias had repaired. The notes were clumsy, but honest, and they filled the air with something beautiful. Giulietta leaned her head on Elias's shoulder. He inhaled deeply the scent of her hair, of earth, of smoke, of everything he now knew he would spend the rest of his life protecting. The sunset lingered warm, endless. On that glowing horizon, their silhouettes melted into one, a man who had lost everything, and a woman who had been left behind, standing together in the light of second chances. As the last light faded behind the hills, Elias whispered, voice trembling in the wind, "The world used to be cold, Giulietta, but now I believe it can be warm again." She smiled through her tears, one drop falling onto his hand, hot, alive, real. Behind them stood the house, sturdy, whole, the field freshly sown, the guitar still singing softly from within. The night crept in, wrapping the prairie in peace. Inside, the four of them gathered around the old wooden table. Elias at the head, Giulietta across from him, ladling stew into bowls. Drew chattered about the fields. Della giggled over burnt bread, the sound laughter, spoons against bowls. The hush of the wind felt like a melody Elias hadn't heard in years. When the meal ended, the children ran out to watch the spring rain. Elias looked around the home, every patched wall, every new beam, the faint light glinting off his old cowboy hat resting on the chair. He stood, picked up the hat, and walked to the door, brushing the dust from its brim. He hung it gently on the wooden hook by the porch. The click was soft, but to Elias, it sounded like a vow. He wasn't leaving again. Giulietta watched from inside, her smile tender. She didn't need him to say it. The gesture was enough. Behind them, the oil lamp flickered, spreading its golden light across the wooden walls. Elias stood quietly at the doorway, his voice deep and calm, the voice of a man finally home in the West. Love doesn't promise forever. It just gives you a reason to begin again. The room fell silent. The curtain swayed gently in the night breeze, the lamplight flickering across Giulietta's peaceful face. Elias turned toward her and the two children laughing outside and felt something stir within him. No longer the heart of a loner, but the heart of a man redeemed. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wild West US. Here, every sunset carries a new beginning. The coldest cowboy who loves through redemption. Love that saves a man from himself. Every story here is a journey of forgiveness and healing, where those who've lost everything find their faith again. And love isn't painted in soft colors, but in courage. In the golden light of that small wooden home, four souls sat together, not perfect, not unscarred, but whole. Because in the end, you don't need to be flawless to be loved, only brave enough to love while you're still healing. The camera pulls back slowly. The lamplight glows through the window, steady in the dark. The wind sweeps across the prairie, carrying the echo of a lone guitar, slow, wistful, and tender. Forgiveness rides longer than revenge. Wild West US, where every broken heart finds its way home.
He found peace, not by forgetting his past, but by forgiving